We fans think we know everything, don't we? We think we know exactly what we want and what fights are the best, and when bouts are made that we just know are the worst, we let everybody know online because people need to hear what we have to say. But guess what? Sometimes we're just wrong, and today I've got a bunch of examples. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. A massive thank you for the continued and awesome support of our channel Hall of Famers, and this is 10 amazing fights nobody thought they wanted. Number 10, Demetrius Johnson versus Tim Elliot. One of the biggest problems DJ faced as a champion is that most everybody just assumed he was going to easily dominate his opponents, especially by the time he got around to Tim Elliot, who would be his then 9th title defense. Compounding this issue was that Tim Elliot was easily the weakest opponent he'd faced as champion. Elliot had been cut from the UFC after a 3-fight skid 2 years previous. The only reason he got his opportunity is because he won a season of Tough that had the premise of flyweight champions from other organizations, Elliot representing Titan FC, competing against each other for a chance to fight the ultimate flyweight in Mighty Mouse. A cool idea besides the fact that nobody takes any organization outside the UFC seriously, especially at 125. So this one just had everything going against it.
Because everybody expects him to be on a different level in comparison to everybody else in the entire sport.
Unless he's somewhere smoking crack and partying and getting prostitutes, he's going to have an amazing performance.
And while it wouldn't end up being some kind of knockdown drag-out banger, the fact that Elliot nearly finished Johnson in the first round with a guillotine choke he would transition into a Darce had everybody losing their minds.
Boy, this is tight. Tim Elliot trying to shock the world here.
It was the only legit trouble anybody could remember from DJ's reign as champion, and it set the tone for the fight and had everybody buzzing afterwards about Elliot, despite the loss on the cards by the end.
I did exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to go out and put on a show and have fun. You know, I did that. That's all I ever want to do.
Number 9, Luke Rockhold versus Paulo Costa. This is one of those fights that when it got announced, you just groaned, oh god, because it felt like that classic scenario of the UFC feeding the old to the young. By this point, Luke Rockhold was certified washed in the eyes of most fans. It's actually insane how negative the sentiment around Luke was, but he was an arrogant guy, and several times over got his comeuppance, with spectacularly devastating losses. After a disaster move to light heavyweight, it felt like Luke was retired without saying so, as he would sit for a full 3 years before returning to fight Costa. Add on top of it that he was clearly in the twilight of his career, and knowing that when Paulo was on his shit, which he very much appeared to be again, he was an absolute destroyer, there was no way to feel anything but sick to your stomach about this fight. And while the outcome would be what everyone expected in terms of the winner and loser, the fight was fantastic, and was the most heart-filled fight we'd ever seen by Rockhold. So much so, in fact, that it had fans completely rethinking how they felt about Luke and his legacy in the sport, finally earning some much-deserved appreciation.
After that war tonight, nothing but respect.
Number 8, Tony Ferguson versus Kevin Lee. Who would have thought the climactic all-time moment of Conor McGregor raising up 2 titles in the mecca of combat sports would lead us to Tony Ferguson versus Kevin Lee, but that's exactly what happened. As McGregor and Floyd Mayweather began setting up their boxing match, the UFC decided to make a fight everybody wanted, and that made the most sense if Conor was going to be out for an extended period to box Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson for interim gold. But the day before, this cursed fight would fall through for what would be the 3rd time at that point, due to Khabib being hospitalized during his weight cut. Maymac would become official and play out in its entirety before the UFC tried to make another bid at setting up an interim champ for his eventual return. But this time it was Tony Ferguson versus number 7 Kevin Lee?
Worse. That's worse.
I suspect this bout took place when it did because UFC 216 was supposed to be headlined by Stipe Miocic versus Cain Velasquez. But when that fell through, the promotion needed some kind of title fight to headline. You would think they would try Tony versus Khabib again, right? Nope, the UFC was not having any of that after he pulled out on fight week and went with Lee, whose last win against number 6 Mike Chiesa was high profile, but also controversial as Mario Yamasaki would botch the finish. Nobody was happy about this one, and a lot of people felt like Khabib got shafted. But the fight would be an awesome, high-paced back and forth that washed away a lot of the bad business surrounding it, especially considering its eventual outcome, the crowning of Tony as the guy since the guy was away. What's really nice about this story is that everything got completely resolved afterwards, and nothing bad ever happened again with that lightweight title. Not anything ever. Number 7, Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier. On paper, this fight looked like a recipe for disaster. Coming off his head kick finish of Volk in their rematch, Islam felt more unbeatable than ever, while Dustin, well, this title shot didn't even feel warranted. He beat prospect Benoit Saint-Denis to earn it. A great win for his late career, but it was only title-worthy because Arman Tsarukyan refused the title bout, and with Poirier's popularity, this seemed like probably the last chance to put him in a title fight.
He doesn't believe he can beat me because, his prime time is finished, and I'm a worse opponent for him right now.
The bout was done no favors when the rest of UFC 302 was one of the most boring cards in the history of the sport. I could not be happier that everybody was wrong about this fight because it's one of my favorites ever. While Makhachev was certainly going to win on the cards, the threat Poirier posed throughout felt very real, and the tension watching this one was through the roof all the way to the dramatic submission finish. As Dustin's final attempt at grabbing gold, if he wasn't going to win, I can't think of a better performance to have given.
That's fighting. That's fighting.
Number 6, Korean Zombie versus Max Holloway. I have never seen a more collective sentiment about a fight announcement than this one. As soon as it came up on our social media feeds that TKZ would be fighting Max Holloway, nearly everybody was in agreement that the UFC was clearly trying to put the Zombie down for good, because why in the world would they make that fight? TKZ had just been absolutely wrecked by Alexander Volkanovski, a title fight that didn't exactly feel that warranted in the first place, and now after that beating, you were going to send him out there to get his face hit 600 plus times by Maximus, who had only ever lost to Volk at featherweight in the last decade? No, this was some kind of messed up joke. The UFC must hate this man, but a joke it was not, and we all braced for the absolute worst as the fight approached. I am beyond thankful that we were all wrong about this one. Set to be Zombie's retirement bout with the opponent he requested, the entire affair would serve as a tribute to everything that made TKZ so beloved, from the walkout to the foot pedal mashed effort, all the way to going out on his shield with the perfect KO loss, if there is one. This could not have been a more fitting send-off for Zombie, and all of us who were worried about this matchup couldn't be happier it took place. Number 5, Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington. Even if you were super into this beef, not a soul was expecting this to be a great fight. While Colby was certainly a high-volume striker, it wasn't like he was putting on bangers every time, more so just overwhelming opponents with strikes that felt like no threat of finishing the bout. And do I even have to talk about Marty Snoozman?
This fucking Usman guy is so fucking boring.
He'd just taken the title from Tyron Woodley in a very impressive, but ultimately boring grapple-heavy showing. And with both fighters' wrestling pedigree, there was concern that the pair might end up just grappling against the cage or on the mat the whole time. Luckily, it was one of those wrestlers who decided to bang it out kind of fights.
I love it when that happens.
And this one was a classic. 5 full rounds of pounding on each other with close calls and broken jaws. The 5th round TKO finish, an epic conclusion to a fight that absolutely nobody saw being anywhere near as good as it would end up. Number 4, Wanderlei Silva versus Hidehiko Yoshida. By the time that these two met in the 2003 middleweight GP semifinal, Vandy had established himself as arguably the best fighter in the world. 13 wins in Pride, no losses. He'd just defeated Sakuraba for the 3rd time in the opening round of the tournament, and he'd successfully defended his Pride middleweight gold twice. So nobody was expecting that much of Hidehiko Yoshida, who, while he had an impressive gold medal judo pedigree and was beloved by the Japanese people, was fighting in just his 4th MMA bout ever, and certainly had not faced anybody on the level of Silva at the time. So hopes weren't high for this bout being anything but a squash. Luckily, everybody was wrong. Not only was it the best fight in the tournament, it was arguably the best fight of 2003 and an all-time Pride classic. Vandy would get the win after the bout went the distance, and later that night KO Rampage to win the tournament and seal his legendary status forever. Number 3, Zhang Weili versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk. When Joanna, former champion, got her title shot against Zhang Weili, the sentiment about the most dominant strawweight in UFC history had changed considerably. She'd never really recovered from those losses to Rose Namajunas. She was gifted a title shot at flyweight, but would be soundly defeated by Valentina Shevchenko. And so while she might be able to stick around in the division if she wanted to, the belief was that Jędrzejczyk at the top of the sport was washed, never to contend again.
No, I'm not getting younger, I'm getting older, and I've been in this business for 15 years. I want to do this one more time, that's it.
And so when she earned another title shot after beating Michelle Waterson, who was popular but not seen as a top-tier strawweight, it honestly felt like the UFC was just gifting Joanna another title fight because it was Joanna. Not to mention Weili, who had just demolished Jessica Andrade in 42 seconds, looked like she might never lose. So everybody was mentally prepared to see one of their faves who didn't have it anymore get wrecked by the new dominant champion. Nope. Fight of the night, fight of the year, best women's fight ever. Legendary status instantly instantly after the final horn. It is without question the most significant part of Jędrzejczyk's legacy after her title reign, and my guess is it will be in the UFC Hall of Fame sooner than later. Number 2, Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum. This fight is the definition of who asked for this. There's no doubt that Kelvin Gastelum had proven himself as a really tough out for anybody, but the excitement level for his middleweight title challenge against Robert Whittaker was pretty minimal. He earned it with a split decision win against Jacare on one of the least watched events in UFC history, and wouldn't see that challenge realized for nearly a whole year because he and Whittaker did a season of Tough that nobody watched.
Bit spicy.
The bad feelings over this title challenge would be compounded when, on the night of the fight, Bobby was forced to pull out and Kelvin walked around with a replica title for some reason, which pissed everybody off.
I know he's not on camera with a belt that's not his.
Meanwhile, Adesanya was very clearly headed for the title picture and was one of the most exciting contenders the sport had seen in some time. So when the UFC announced this unnecessary interim title bout between them, as Whittaker would be recovered just a few months later, nobody was happy or expected this to be any kind of good. Turns out it would be an all-time classic, one of the defining moments of Adesanya's career. This absolute banger showed the best of both fighters in terms of their grit and why they're exciting to watch. Not only that, it actually made that interim title feel meaningful, even though it was pointless. So yeah, we were wrong on all fronts on this one. Number 1, Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson. There are only 2 types of Jon Jones fights. The ones that everybody is overhyped about because they think the contender has a legit chance to dethrone the king of the sport, and the ones where going in, everybody automatically assumes that Jon is going to completely dominate and make his opponent look silly. Gus would fall into that latter category. When they hooked up for the first time, JBJ had already reached legendary status. He'd beat the best of a generation, and capped it off by ending 2 top-tier middleweights in Vitor Belfort and Chael Sonnen. Not only that, but minus a single armbar attempt, Jones had looked virtually unstoppable. On the other hand, Alex, he was good. He was doing well. 7-1 in the UFC, just earned a decision against Shogun Rua. I mean, he was clearly the next guy for a title shot. Glover Teixeira still needed a few more high-profile wins. DC was still at heavyweight in Strikeforce. There was pretty much nobody at that point but Gus. So he was kind of the default contender, which is never something you want to be called, and it's why nobody was expecting much out of this fight. Thank the MMA gods, we were all wrong. This Hall of Fame fight is still to this day what many fans feel was the truest test JBJ ever had. An absolute classic all-timer. If you've not yet watched it, what exactly are you waiting for? One of the best title fights ever. I'll tell you who I think JBJ's real truest test was. The editor of this video, Max Randall. Please follow him on all his socials and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. Another big thank you to our channel Hall of Famers. Your support really does mean a lot, and we cannot thank you guys enough. Fight fans, if you want to be a Hall of Famer too, hit the join button. There's exclusive content, there's writers meetings, all kinds of stuff. You're gonna love it. Like and subscribe or they will book Tony versus Khabib again. Leave a comment about which of these fights you secretly knew was gonna be a banger, and thank you so much for watching, guys. Have a wonderful day.